Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with the Dean. I'm Penny Bishop, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. I really value these conversations when BU Wheelock experts and guests help us think through some of the most pressing concerns facing education today. And we do this always through the lens of our Guide Star, which focuses on transforming systems that impact education and human development. And today we'll be focusing on fair student loans and exploring student debt forgiveness, the programs that associate with those, and overlooked state initiatives. Our panel will discuss accessibility barriers, systemic inequities, and policy solutions to better support historically marginalized groups. I'm delighted this afternoon to be joined by two BU researchers who are giving this their very, very deep attention. Dr. Jerry Whitmore, Jr. is an assistant professor in higher education administration at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Jerry's work focuses on the scholarship of higher education, educational history, leadership, and sociology. He's the lead researcher of the Fair Student Loans Project, which works on fostering accessibility and inclusive reform in student loan forgiveness. We're also joined by Nina Cesare, a research scientist at Boston University's School of Public Health. Nina's work brings together data science and sociology, and she uses sociological theory to guide her questions and explores new kinds of social data to understand the patterns and trends shaping our world today. She also works with the Fair Student Loan Project. Welcome, Jerry and Nina. And Nina, thank you so much for visiting us from the School of Public Health. We really appreciate it. So let's begin. Folks in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to integrate them into our conversation. We really appreciate it when we have that kind of audience participation, and we know that there are a lot of questions out there on student loan, on the topic of student loans in general. And to me personally, this is certainly a question that is apt as someone who took student loans out myself as a college student. And so I have a personal interest in learning more as well. So Jerry, I'm going to ask you to start us off here today, if you would. I'd love to hear why the work is personally meaningful to you.
Yes, again, Dean Bishop, thank you so much for having us here with you today. This particular question is something that's dear to my heart, and actually to my family as well. As you just mentioned, for yourself, I too was a recipient of student loans. And I would like to say that those student loans actually covered the vast majority of my educational kind of cost from undergrad to graduate school. So it was something that was, kind of deeply personal and meaningful to me. The other aspect is, the title of this particular webinar, kind of fair student loans, just thinking about like what is the fairness within the student loan process, and how do we, how does my research interest kind of align with how we are not only uncovering the data and the information, but how are we telling these stories? Because we understand that there are multiple figures out there. The Department of Education actually put a new figure out that said 1.6, but there's also some data out there that says that student loan debt could be somewhere above the 1.8 trillion kind of mark. That is a lot. That is actually a larger portfolio that some of our major financial institutions in the country. These are institutions that have a workforce of 200,000 people. So think about the education department that has a workforce that is much smaller than it. Just thinking about this impact. So you have this large number, and how do we actually service these particular things? And what are these policies? These are important, and we have to emphasize that this problem, fuels our national, state level conversations, and how we talk about these particular programs and the inequities that are often overlooked.
Thank you for putting it in that perspective. Nina, how about you? Why is it personally meaningful to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, kind of similar to Jerry's story. I was part of a generation of college entrants who were sort of believers in this narrative that college was the way to get ahead. It was the way to advance your professional life. It was the way to advance your financial goals. And to some extent, that's still true. One of my parents went to college, the other one did not have that opportunity, and is very much impressed upon me. Like, if you want to build your future, this is the step. And we're finding that the sort of cost to doing so is a lot higher than anticipated. That it's having sort of these long-term financial impacts on individuals and their ability to gain financial stability and sort of build those protective factors that influence your health later in life. And we're finding that these effects are disproportionately distributed. So my background is in sociology. I currently work in public health. Everything is health related in some way, right? The debt that you carry, the impact it has on your long-term financial well-being, that all in some way affects your health, right? These are, in essence, social determinants of health that we're exploring. And I'm grateful to have been included in this project at its initiation and to have been able to follow it as it's grown and developed and become this sort of long-term initiative to really understand and track policy and make this information accessible to anyone who's interested, whether that's, scholars in the field, whether that's borrowers who are trying to sort of put themselves in context, sort of anyone who's trying to get a better handle on what's happening with the student loan crisis. And we have this unique perspective that we're looking at state student loan forgiveness policies, and just really adding a richness to the policy debate that I don't think has been there yet. So yeah, it's personally meaningful, it's professionally meaningful. Everything is health in some way or the other. And I've tried to sort of use that perspective to frame how we've pursued the questions that we ask.
I love thinking about it with that lens. That sort of idea of social determinants of health is a great jumping off point. And Jerry, you touched a little bit on the enormity of this already. Tell us a little bit more about it. How would you describe what's really going on with the debt crisis in the U.S. right now, sort of big picture?
I think probably for most attendees of this webinar, or those that have just checked out a news article probably just this morning or click before you came on here, we understand that over 40 million Americans are affected by student loan debt. We understand that the average debt for undergraduate degrees is now upwards of over $30,000. And so this is a steady growth that we have seen, since the 1990s. So this is something that we've seen, kind of just being exacerbated. And we have these conversations about income equality, the racial wealth gap, um, and to put things in perspective, and understanding that these student loan programs that we have had and degree attainment and this debt hasn't necessarily closed the gap that a lot of us, particularly scholars in the field, have talked about when we're having this conversation about the racial wealth gap. And when we also talk about what is that life beyond student debt? Let's say a borrower graduates with debt. Is that quality of life the same as someone that does not, have that? So there are, there's many questions that are out there, that these impacts are far reaching. As my colleague just stated, coming from public health and thinking about social determinants of health, um, these things are very important for us in our particular work, and we're hopeful that we are calling out these issues and calling attention to these as we are having these particular conversations.
Thank you so much, Jerry. So Nina, I understand that there's a tracker associated with this. I'd love to hear more and tell our audience a little bit about that and we're hoping to accomplish with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this extends directly from what Jerry was saying. This is a very high profile sort of, I don't want to use the word crisis, but sort of growing issue that we're facing, right? There's increasing higher education enrollment. There's increasing ever accumulated debt. there are these sort of widening disparities in sort of who's benefiting from the system. I think it's a topic that's common in public discourse, and it's a topic that a lot of people see themselves in. And so our goal in building this tracker was to create a very sort of digestible, high-level summary of the current state student loan policy landscape. So there's sort of a couple goals here. One, we focused on state policy specifically because this adds a layer to the student loan forgiveness conversation that we think is sort of understudied, underacknowledged. And that is that, yes, there are these federal programs available to assist borrowers, but there are a number of state programs and a lot of state legislation out there as well that also intends to help solve this problem, fill this gap, help borrowers try to make this sort of cost of higher education, long-term worth it for students. And we want to make sure that that is, consolidated, that it is tracked in a way that's systematic and continuously updated. You can find all of these pieces of information about what programs exist at the state level, but you cannot find them in one place. So that is sort of our goal in creating this consolidated tracker. And because we've created this sort of very concise way of framing the state student loan conversation in terms of, state by state policy availability and impact, we've really emphasized the role of translational science in making sure this information is accessible. So again, a lot of people see themselves in this conversation. A lot of people are affected by, the sort of the cost of carrying student debt. And a lot of these conversations about impact, about the ways in which carrying debt out of college affects your long-term financial health, they sort of stay within the academy, but we want to make sure that folks kind of understand big picture, the exact questions you're asking here, like how do we characterize this current moment that we find ourselves in? Who is affected by these sort of accumulating amounts of debt? In what ways are we seeing inequities emerge? And do these state policies sort of help fill a gap in maybe who's left behind within federal policy? Or are we seeing sort of, potentially the same disparities, persist because there's sort of this need that's not necessarily being met at either the federal or the state level? Those are sort of our goals for building this tracker and our goals for putting this tracker out there on a website with our research, with context that's all very digestible, very sort of plain English, very, accessible to whoever wants to learn more.
That is really helpful. And I know that we'll be putting some links in the chat if we haven't already. So for those of us who are listening in and want to learn more, continue to monitor the chat to find some links to learn where to find this tracker and such. Okay, so thank you, Nina, so much. I want to go back to you, Jerry, for a moment. So I hear a staggering number like 1.7 trillion in student debt, and it's so hard to get my head around. But what does it actually look like for real people trying to pay off their loans or move forward in life? Like bring that down to sort of the size that I can comprehend.
Yes. And before I get there, I want to add in a few other nuggets that we can kind of put perspective on a lot of these numbers as well. One of the things that we talk about in this country is that higher education is a public good. We have it in this public good conversation. Simultaneously, we will say that, K-12 education should be something that's more than accessible, it should be free. So if you look at these particular ways in which we talk about higher education in this country, if you have access, is that going to be equally distributed? Again, we say K-12 and it should be free. Higher ed is a public good, but it may not be equally distributed. And I want to point that kind of nugget out there that kind of puts a pin into what these numbers turn into. And we also understand that minority serving institutions such as HBCUs, HSIs, which are historically Black colleges and universities, HSIs, our other minority serving institutions, are not equitably funded. And they have structural barriers as well. So I want to put those few nuggets in there to then go in and say that amongst all borrowers, minoritized or more minority borrowers carry the biggest burden out of this. And so what we also see is that amongst those bachelor degrees, Black students are more likely to borrow federal student loans in particular. On average, Black students owe $3,000, almost $4,000 more than their white counterparts. Black borrowers are oftentimes going to have a much larger long-term impact to this that can turn into financial insecurity due to student loans, and we see this as well as this plays out in how they also enter into the workforce, the jobs that they get and pay. We start seeing this in home ownership as well. So we see this in many different ways. And I'll also say that when I said that the earlier that student loan debt we saw that kind of increase since the 1990s, the White House put out a fact sheet in 2022 that said a typical Black borrower who started college in the late 1990s still owed 95% of their initial debt. And this is over 30 years later. So we see that, and I mentioned the housing piece, and I wanted to do this because this goes into kind of like quality of life as well. Half of Black borrowers are also shown to have defaults on loans, while a third of our Latin and Hispanic borrowers do, compared to 20% of our Asian population as well. So we see all of these things, how it really impacts our minoritized, marginalized voters, as well as our military veterans as well. So we see a lot of these things in that kind of number. So when you first hear that 1.7 trillion number or the higher number on the 1.8, it sounds like a lot, but that impact and that burden is specifically on our vulnerable populations.
Really appreciate your shedding that light on sort of that basic inequitable burden distribution, Jerry. Thank you. I think one of the interesting things about our focus today is the nature of the state level. Like there's always this sort of understanding of the loans being at a federal or national level, but there are a lot of state programs, and I know that's our focus for today. And I think there are some things about loan forgiveness in particular, Nina, that you might be able to help us understand a bit more about. Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We kind of have laid some groundwork here to kind of establish that like everyone is like not everyone, a lot of people are carrying student loan debt, right? And this burden is not equitably distributed. And again, part of our goal in tracking state level policy is to sort of try and see like, okay, do we perceive that state level policy is sort of filling that gap and catching the folks who are maybe carrying a disproportionate debt burden, who, may be facing these sort of larger barriers to long-term financial gain due to things like default rates, and sort of higher balance rates many years after graduation. And so we, went through state by state, tracked legislation related to loan forgiveness, identified the programs that were directly derivative of those legislative choices, and we characterized these programs according to a variety of dimensions. And one of the dimensions that we really focused on were, of course, eligibility criteria. So most of these programs are not sort of general access, right? They have very sort of strict eligibility requirements for borrowers, right? And they vary a lot in a lot of the other sort of parameters in terms of the total amount forgivable in terms of renewability, in terms of, total work requirements. But generally speaking, they almost all contain some sort of professional eligibility requirement. About 2/3 of them were specifically targeted towards medical professionals. About 14% focused on legal professionals, and about 10% were targeted towards educators. And what's sort of noteworthy about this is that a lot of these sort of targeted career pathways are ones that require education beyond undergraduate training. So there's sort of this additional cost that needs to be incurred in order to even become eligible for a lot of these state student loan programs. We also found that a lot of these programs incentivized or even required applicants to agree to work in underserved and or rural areas within the state. And that's sort of another barrier, right? Having to sort of go to this place that you may not have social resources in, you may not have additional financial supports in, and establish your career there is sort of a high hurdle for folks to clear. And all in all, with these factors combined, we kind of walked away from this first round of tracking, kind of thinking, these programs may not be filling the gaps that they need to fill, right? They may not be catching the people who are in fact carrying a disproportionate amount of debt. The career pathways that most of them focus on, again, require folks to take this additional step of, school beyond undergraduate education, which is, oftentimes a luxury afforded to those who are able to sort of, pay for undergraduate education or carry that debt in some other, more well-supported way. It's not accessible for everyone. And so, we've sort of painted a landscape of programs that, have this potential to acknowledge the disparities that exist. And, we're seeing that more can be done at this stage to sort of even the playing field and make education, higher education, more of a public good for everyone.
So Nina, I know that a lot of our listeners are either teachers or have been, or we have a lot of alums who are out there listening as well. And so we're getting a few questions that are coming in about sort of public school teaching and forgiveness programs related to that, particularly in the Commonwealth. I don't know if that is a data point that either of you have that specific in mind or not. I know the tracker is probably one way to get some of that information, but could either of you speak to that?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would encourage the folks asking to explore the tracker. I don't know if I have that pulled up at the moment.
Fair enough.
We are seeing that there are, the number of programs available within states varies significantly.
Yeah.
There are several available within Massachusetts, anywhere from 1 to, I believe, 17 programs were identified across states. And again, a lot of them have these sort of professional requirements. And the incentive seems to be, to pull people back to a state to serve the state, right? And to, potentially fill a needed gap, like, getting people in staff positions in secondary and primary school, and especially in places where, schools may find themselves understaffed. Yeah, a lot of these programs seem to really be about state well-being and about making sure that, the state can sustain itself within these industries, especially in underserved areas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to add to that. So Massachusetts is not one of our states that has, a plethora of options for teachers' education in particular. One of the things that we did say, and the reason why I wanted to say this, highlight this, is that many of these policies were created as we were kind of diving into the policy creation based upon constituents talking to their local representatives and their constituents to create these particular policies. And this is one of those moments where I will kind of, shout out as loud as I can that we as individuals can speak to our local policymakers and those that represent us on a state level to think about these particular policies and these particular programs. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, absolutely. The landscape changes all the time, and we're continuously updating the tracker. And a lot of that is based on, active policy change.
It's such an important resource. It's terrific that we have it. So thank you for creating it and monitoring and updating so regularly. So let's see, Jerry, you have a question in the chat from Saul. Saul, thanks for chiming in. And I suspect actually you both might find interesting things to say about this question. What are the drivers, if the data are sufficient to identify them, of the disparities in debt, debt service, and debt default rates among the various racial groups that you described?
Great question. So this is one that I'm like super excited about. The data isn't sufficient here because we are wanting to ask more questions about actually knowledge about these particular programs. So keep in mind, this particular website and the birth out of this project was one that we were having conversations about knowledge. Is the public aware of these particular programs? I was just in a talk with the former Secretary of Education, Cardona, 2 days ago. He and I had this conversation that prior to, and this is on the federal level, prior to the previous administration, the number was somewhere, kind of, maybe it was in a couple of thousands or hundred thousands that had went through loan forgiveness programs. And then after they took office, it jumped in the millions. So one of the driving forces behind things is education. Well, we don't accurately have data from individuals that lets us know, like, were they properly informed about these particular policies, whether it's on the federal level or on the state level. And then were they matching those criteria that my colleague Nina was talking about? Were they eligible for these particular? These are the things that we don't know. As of right now, we have data that basically shows us what that burden is, who carries that burden, not these particular reasons why. And so we can have these, we can speak anecdotally to this, and future research is going to point us in a direction to do some qualitative work to actually speak to these individuals. But that is one of the driving forces. I will also add, and I started to speak about this a little bit. Our minority serving institutions, those HBCUs, our regional institutions, or institutions that have a higher level of Pell eligible students are also institutions or spaces where a lot of this debt burden is also, often carried as well. So those are some of the things that we can kind of say is driving, but that data right there from our research team isn't fully packaged for us to do that. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that within the next couple of months to a year as we've expanded our team.
Yeah. As a person who loves data, this project has been an interesting one in that identifying the appropriate sources to be able to make these like quasi-causal links between policy availability and long-term economic trajectory, total debt burden has been really challenging. And just identifying the appropriate sources to be able to understand, at a fine-grained demographic level, total debt burden, and potentially track and trace that as well to wealth accumulation. It's a major challenge to get all these pieces of data together and triangulate. And existing literature has sort of identified additional life factors like discrimination in the workplace, family cost burden, those sort of factors in influencing, challenges in repayment. But we're really interested in this question of policy, and making that policy connection with the data that's out there is really, really challenging.
I appreciate that, and it links to another question related to sort of the challenges inherent in doing the kind of research and policy work that you do. So you touched on that a little bit, Nina, but for either of you, is there anything that would make the research easier? What are the biggest barriers in making it more powerful? What are the methodological struggles, if I may?
I think we were both alluding to this.
Yes.
I think when we're going into the research speech when we're talking about these causal inferences or causal claims that we're trying to place out here, we just want to make sure that we have good data. And, this is one of those things that we oftentimes talk about within our research group, being able to have access
Mm-hmm.
to data that we're then able to kind of have fun with and kind of really understand what is going on. And the data out there sometimes is incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one of the largest barriers that we have, I think. And then since we're focused in on the state level policies in particular, being able to do that when all 50 states have the ability to, handle data in any shape, form, or fashion that they want to, that it's not, there is no standardized process, makes it challenging there. And our students move in and out, or families move in and out of various states. So it's really hard for us for researchers to really kind of pinpoint a lot of this work. So a lot of work has been done out there on specific programs like PSLF, and things of that nature, because we are able to kind of zero in on populations. But doing this kind of broader research that we're doing right now, we're in that kind of messy phase of
Yeah.
things, and knocking on doors to get information.
Genuinely like communicating with states to try and get access to
Yes.
detailed data. Yeah, I mean, there's state policy data, there is institutional data, but as Jerry said, students move around. We don't necessarily know where they ended up in their postgraduate years. And then this additional question of, how does student debt impact people long term? How does it impact wealth accumulation? Is another layer of complexity. I think in a dream world, we'd have a giant cohort study,
Mm-hmm.
but that's
Yes.
maybe a long ways from now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you to step outside of this study for a moment because we have a few questions about the role of institutions in this. And I know that that is not associated with this particular study, but it is certainly something that you know an awful lot about in terms, I'm sure, and think a lot about given the research that you do and the connection to higher education. And there are a few questions about that are evocative of the broader moment we find ourselves in, where the value of higher education is being questioned and the price of that. And so would either of you be able to comment on sort of what you see as the core responsibilities of universities to better control costs? Either you want to tackle that one?
I think this is a great question. I would like to say it is extremely related,
Mhm.
and how we think about this. And one thing that we haven't talked about in this conversation, and I'll open up another can of worms, is the inflation. We
Mhm.
oftentimes talk about inflation more broadly in our country. We don't have these conversations about higher education inflation. We
Mhm.
do have that when we hear families or students talk about, well, it used to cost this amount of money, this much to go to school back in my day, or in the
Mhm.
90s, or the early 2000s, and what it is today. I think these conversations are important. And so higher education has a responsibility on multi fronts about, like, how do we articulate the value of our degrees, and also, like, what does that quality of life looks afterwards. I don't want to. I struggle sometimes having a conversation about ROI
Mhm.
for some of our listeners, having this conversation about return on an investment. That is a term and a phrase that is picking up steam
Mhm.
as something to kind of combat this exploding debt crisis that we do have.
Mhm.
For those, to give an example, saying that, hey, if you are majoring in a certain discipline, this is the cost of it. Once you graduate, you're able to either pay that back, or it matches the cost of that particular degree. these are some of the kind of broader conversations out there. I think that institutional leaders, major institutions should have this conversation. This conversation should not be driven by, to be clear, our elite institutions in our country. And oftentimes that is the conversation we have. We talk about the BUs, tuitions, the Harvards, but it's easier for us, and we should be centering those state institutions, and we can go into the 2-year conversation as well, where the majority of our students are, to think about like what does that cost of attendance look like? How is this impacting your students? And it should be happening on a local level. If you are in the state of Idaho and you are, watching this webinar, you shouldn't be thinking that your tuition cost or that cost of education should not match, the cost of attendance in Massachusetts. So it's so many different things that we need to have in this conversation, but higher ed should, in theory, potentially be driving these particular conversations. This is our bread and butter. This is our craft. We know our particular space, and we have these good relationships with the industry where our students go to.
Mhm.
Yeah. I may not be the person to sort of speak to like the institutional change that needs to happen, but this point of, the image of higher education as sort of being quote unquote worth it is up in the air at this point. In public health, we're sort of facing a similar crisis of faith and a similar image issue, and we sort of find ourselves in this position where we have to communicate the importance of what we're doing and the sort of real world impact of what we're doing. And I think for this question of the cost of higher ed and the sort of ROI concept of higher ed, this kind of conversation is exactly the thing that needs to happen. Institutions need to be accountable and open, and they need to engage with folks who are directly impacted by this sort of mounting challenge that we're facing.
Mhm. Thank you both. I'm wondering, as you look ahead, you think about your research and your research teams, and then you think about this context of higher ed more broadly, and certainly the return on investment piece, as well as the inequitable distribution of the burden that we've talked about today. If you could change one thing, what do you think would make the biggest difference in making college more affordable and fair for everyone?
I think one of the biggest changes that we have is that states actually can adopt inclusive loan forgiveness programs because they know their constituents. This can be down to that granular level, so that the federal government, or what we see in the federal government that is kind of in our face today, can be a supplement
Mhm.
to things that we have going on.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely correct. And there's sort of, I think, 2 layers to that as well. There's sort of aligning policy with lived experience, connecting with constituents to better design policy that meets needs. And there's also sort of this, we've talked internally, like there's this anti-DEI pressure, frankly, that's sort of making the conversation about there being an unlevel playing field and there being unequal debt distributions maybe not top of mind. As we combed through promotional materials, legislative materials for programs across all these states, we found that they very rarely specifically mentioned or targeted minoritized borrowers. And that's a huge gap. I think it's something that legislatures have to not be afraid to address and to recognize the need for state policy to correct this wrong in some way and to fill this gap for borrowers.
Mhm. And this focus on the state level is interesting to me in this moment where we see potentially more autonomy given to states, as we see increasing turmoil at the federal level in the Department of Education and the reorg there and the potential for dismantling, and as we see different pieces being sort of farmed out to the Department of Labor. And I know you're focused on the state level, but I'm wondering, for those people listening who are concerned about that turmoil, should they be worried about that in relation to the debt conversation we're having now? Is there can you connect those dots for us?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think that we all know things are changing very rapidly in our country right now. Debt burden is serious. It's a crisis in the way that we're having this conversation today.
Mm.
And unfortunately, at this particular moment, I would tell everyone be cautious about things. That also means that, I would hope everyone, stay up to date and kind of current on the Department of Ed's website. They are putting out information. It may not be information that everyone likes to see, but they do update things as regular as possible, and they do have public comment sections. This also means that with the first point of things changing rapidly, you all need to be up to date on particular things. Unfortunately, I've been speaking to individuals. There have been changes to student loan policy on the federal level that we have received notification from like a New York Times article
Mm.
versus receiving it in an inbox for you all. So that could be the worry part right there. And we're still in this phase. I mean, we just got new information from the Department of Ed within the last 48 hours. And I think there was similar notification that came out in statement, before for this call. And unfortunately, there was a time period where we could kind of relax and just wait, every 6 months to a year to receive something. In this particular moment, I tell everyone that currently currently owes loans is to check information weekly.
Mhm.
Um, that's my kind of best advice for this particular moment.
Yeah.
Good advice indeed. Nina, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Staying current is essential. And I think, we're tracking state level policy, we're tracking federalized decisions, right? And this is policy that can be shaped directly by constituents. And so being informed and being vocal are two great strategies.
Timely advice. Nina Caesar and Jerry Whitmore, thank you both so much for spending some time with us today. This conversation always goes too quickly. Appreciate those of you in the audience as well, asking good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them today. Really want to, again, thank you, Jerry and Nina. To our audience, if you're interested in pursuing some of these ideas more, you might like to know that BU Wheelock is a leader in the field. In fact, our Ed Policy program is in the top 25 in the nation. We'd love to hear from you and welcome you to BU Wheelock. So there's an email on the screen about more information about how to get in touch with us. I also want to mention that on December 11th, we'll have our next Conversations with the Dean, and it's on the future of English learners in America. With new policies reshaping support and funding, we'll explore what these changes mean for these 5 million students and the pursuit of equitable education. And then we'll see you in the new year on January 29th for a timely conversation on the future of special education as educators and advocates navigate new challenges to equity and access. So thank you all for joining us today, and to Nina and Jerry for such a great conversation. Have a great afternoon.